My name is Madison, 32 years old, standing in the home I shared with my husband Daniel, staring at our wedding photo through tear-stained eyes. Just 2 days ago, I buried the love of my life after his battle with brain cancer. Now his father Richard has summoned me for an urgent meeting about family property and bloodlines. The message was cold, calculating, mentioning something about assets returning to their rightful owners. I feel strangely calm despite the storm I sense approaching. Before I share what happened next, I would love to know where you are watching from today. Please hit that like button and subscribe to hear how a grieving widow discovered a truth about her own identity that changed everything about inheritance and justice. 5 years ago, my life changed when I met Daniel Morrison at a tech conference in downtown Seattle. He was 35, a successful software engineer who had just launched his own branch of his family's company. I was 27, working as a user experience designer at a struggling startup, passionate about my work, but barely making ends meet. Daniel approached me after my presentation about intuitive design, and we talked for 3 hours straight, missing the entire afternoon session of the conference. Daniel was everything his family was not. Where they were cold and calculating, he was warm and genuine. Where they measured worth in bank statements and bloodlines, he valued creativity and character. Our first date lasted 12 hours, starting with coffee and ending with sunrise at Pike Place Market. We talked about everything from our favourite books to our dreams for the future. He told me about growing up in wealth but feeling emotionally impoverished about parents who saw children as legacy investments rather than individuals to love. We married exactly 1 year after that first meeting in a small ceremony at Snoqualmie Falls with just 20 close friends. His family attended reluctantly, his father Richard arriving late and leaving early, his mother Patricia spending the entire reception correcting my pronunciation of French wines. His older brother Thomas, a corporate lawyer, handed me a prenuptial agreement at the rehearsal dinner, which Daniel tore up in front of everyone, causing the first of many family rifts. Richard Morrison was 62 years old, CEO of Morrison Construction Group, a company he claimed to have built from nothing, but which I would later learn had much darker origins. He stood 6'3" with silver hair, always perfectly styled custom suits that cost more than most people's monthly salary, and eyes that evaluated everything like assets on a balance sheet. He had made his displeasure about our marriage clear from day one, calling me a gold digger despite the fact that I had refused Daniel's offer to quit my job and be supported. Patricia Morrison, 59, was the perfect corporate wife, her entire identity wrapped up in her husband's success. She had given up her own career as an attorney 30 years ago to support Richard's ambitions, and now seemed to resent any woman who chose differently. She would make subtle comments about my simple wedding dress, my small engagement ring that Daniel and I had chosen together, my decision to keep my maiden name professionally. Every interaction felt like an evaluation I was destined to fail. Thomas Morrison, 38, had followed in his father's footsteps, but in law rather than construction. He was married to a senator's daughter and lived in a $7 million estate in Medina. He looked at me the way someone might look at a stain on expensive furniture, something unfortunate that needed to be removed as soon as possible. He had actually offered me $50,000 to leave Daniel before our wedding, which I had recorded on my phone, though I never told Daniel about it. Jennifer Morrison, Daniel's younger sister at 30, was recently divorced and living back with her parents. Her ex-husband had gotten most of their assets in the divorce due to Thomas representing him instead of her, a betrayal she seemed to have forgotten in her desperation to maintain her position in the family hierarchy. She would often make comments about how lucky I was to have snagged Daniel, implying that I had somehow tricked him into marriage. Despite his family's coldness, Daniel and I built a beautiful life together. We purchased a home in Bellevue for $1.8 million, which Daniel insisted be in both our names equally. The house was our sanctuary, a modern craftsman with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Washington. Daniel had given me free rein to decorate it, and I had filled it with warmth and colour, everything his childhood home had lacked. Daniel's branch of the family company, Morrison Tech Solutions, was valued at $5 million. He had built it from a small division his father had given him to get him out of the way into a thriving enterprise that actually generated more profit than the construction side of the business. Richard hated that Daniel had succeeded without his help, that his son had proven capable of independent success. We also had investment accounts worth $2 million, carefully diversified and managed. Daniel had taught me about financial planning, and we would spend Sunday mornings over coffee reviewing our portfolio planning for the future we thought we would have together. We dreamed of children, of traveling the world, of eventually starting a foundation to help underprivileged kids get into technology. Then came the diagnosis. Daniel had been having headaches for months, which we attributed to stress from a major project. When his vision started blurring, I finally convinced him to see a doctor. The MRI revealed a glioblastoma grade 4, inoperable due to its location. The doctor gave us 6 to 12 months. Daniel lasted 8. Those 8 months changed everything about our relationship with his family. As Daniel grew weaker, they grew more distant. Richard visited exactly 3 times each visit, lasting less than 15 minutes. Patricia sent flowers but never came, herself claiming the hospital made her anxious. Thomas sent a single text message, offering to handle Daniel's legal affairs, which felt more like a vulture circling than a brother offering support. Jennifer came once, spent the entire time taking photos for her Instagram with captions about family tragedy, then left when Daniel vomited from the chemotherapy. She never came back. I took family medical leave from my job, spending every moment with Daniel. I learned to manage his medications, to change his IVs to be strong when he was scared, and scared when he needed to be strong for me. I held him through seizures, cleaned him when he lost control of his body, and read to him when the pain made it impossible for him to focus on screens. In his final days, Daniel made me promise something that seemed strange at the time. He said to keep every document, every email, every piece of paper related to our life together. He said to make copies of everything and store them in multiple places. When I asked why, he just squeezed my hand and said that sometimes the truth needs help being found. Daniel died on a Tuesday morning at 4:17 a.m., holding my hand and whispering that marrying me was the only thing in his life that had ever made complete sense. His last words were not about his family or his company or his wealth. They were simply that he loved me and that I was stronger than I knew. The funeral home contacted his family, but I made all the arrangements. Daniel had been specific about what he wanted, a celebration of life rather than a somber memorial. He wanted his favourite music played, photos of our adventures shown, and donations made to brain cancer research instead of flowers. I spent 2 days making sure everything was exactly as he wished, even though I could barely see through my tears. Richard called once during this time not to offer condolences or help, but to ask about the cost of the funeral and whether I expected them to contribute. I told him I had it handled, that Daniel had set aside funds for this purpose. He seemed disappointed, as if he had hoped I would need to beg him for money. The funeral took place at the Fairmont Olympic Hotel in downtown Seattle, a venue Daniel had specifically requested because we had spent our first anniversary there. 300 people attended, a testament to the life Daniel had lived beyond his family's cold dynasty. His colleagues from the tech world came in droves, young entrepreneurs he had mentored, competitors who had become friends, employees who spoke of him with genuine affection rather than corporate obligation. I had arranged everything exactly as Daniel wanted. Instead of traditional funeral music, we played his Spotify playlist, an eclectic mix of classic rock and modern indie bands. The walls were covered with photos from our travels together, our trip to Thailand, where Daniel had tried to ride an elephant and fallen off, laughing, our camping adventure in Yellowstone, where he had been terrified of a chipmunk, our quiet moments at home where his smile could light up the entire room. His family arrived 20 minutes late, Richard leading the procession in his black Bentley, Patricia beside him, checking her phone, Thomas and Jennifer in Thomas's Tesla behind them. They entered the venue like visiting royalty gracing peasants, with their presence taking seats in the back row, despite the front being reserved for family. I had to send Daniel's best friend Marcus to escort them forward, which they did with visible reluctance. During the service, Daniel's colleagues shared stories that painted a picture his family had never bothered to see. How he had personally funded scholarships for underprivileged coding students, how he had refused to implement layoffs during the pandemic, taking a pay cut himself instead, how he had created the most inclusive, innovative workspace in Seattle's competitive tech scene. With each story, I watched Richard's jaw clench tighter as if Daniel's kindness was a personal betrayal of the Morrison legacy. When it came time for family remarks, Richard stood and delivered a cold, brief statement about Daniel's contribution to the family business and his unfortunate early passing. Not once did he use the words love, miss, or proud. Patricia simply nodded from her seat. Thomas checked his phone throughout his father's speech. Jennifer was taking selfies, angling to get the flower arrangements in the background. After the formal service, we held a reception in the hotel's garden room. Daniel had wanted people to eat, drink, and share memories, rather than stand around in somber silence. The catering included his favourite foods from around the city, Thai food, from the place where we had our first official date pizza, from the joint near his office, where we would meet for lunch, cupcakes from the bakery, where we had ordered our simple wedding cake, while guests mingled and shared warm memories. Richard cornered me near the memorial photo display. His breath smelled of the whiskey he had been drinking steadily since arrival, and his eyes held a coldness that made me step back instinctively. Now that Daniel is gone, he said, his voice low but firm, everything needs to return to its rightful place. The family assets, the company holdings, the real estate, blood family Madison. You were a pleasant distraction for my son, but that chapter is closed. I stared at him, too shocked to immediately respond. My husband's body was barely cold, and his father was already trying to stake claims on our life together. Before I could speak, Jennifer appeared at his elbow, her phone still in her hand, but her attention fully on our conversation. Dad's right, she said with a sympathetic smile that never reached her eyes. You have to understand these are Morrison family assets. Daniel would want them to stay in the family. The house alone is worth nearly $2 million now. You cannot possibly expect to keep it. Thomas materialized on Richard's other side, his lawyer instincts clearly engaged. We should discuss this properly, he said in his courtroom voice. There are legal precedents for family property reverting after death, especially in cases without children. We are prepared to offer you a generous settlement to ease your transition. As if my husband's death was just a corporate restructuring and I was an employee being laid off with a severance package. I looked at these three people, vultures dressed in designer black, and felt something cold and hard form in my chest where my heart used to be. This is neither the time nor the place for this conversation. I said, my voice steadier than I felt. We are here to honour Daniel's memory, not discuss property division. Richard's face flushed red, a vein pulsing in his temple. Do not presume to tell me how to honour my son, he spat. You knew him for 5 years. I knew him for 38. Everything he had came from this family, from the foundation I built. You contributed nothing but distraction. Patricia finally approached, placing a jeweled hand on Richard's arm in what looked like restraint but felt like reinforcement. Madison, dear, she said in her practiced society voice, we understand you are grieving. We all are, but surely you can see the logic here. Daniel's assets should remain with those who share his blood. It is what he would have wanted. You mean what you want, I replied, looking her directly in the eye. Daniel's wants were made very clear in his will, which I am sure we will all review with proper legal counsel at the appropriate time. Thomas laughed, a sharp sound like breaking glass. Legal counsel? You cannot be serious. I have been the family's attorney for 15 years. I know every document, every trust, every provision. Daniel may have left you some personal effects, but the real assets, the company, the properties, those have reversions built in. Blood family Madison. You were never really family. Jennifer had started taking photos of the memorial displays, the guest book, even the catering setup. Making an inventory, she said when she caught me watching. We will need documentation of funeral expenses for the estate filing. I assume you kept all the receipts. The cruelty of it all, the casual dismissal of my grief and my marriage was breathtaking. But Daniel had warned me this might happen. In his final weeks, when his mind was still clear, he had told me his family would come for everything. He had also told me to let them think they were winning at first, to document everything they said and did. I excused myself to attend to other guests, leaving the Morrison family cluster to their plotting, but I made sure my phone was recording in my pocket, capturing Thomas's confident assertions about reversionary clauses and Richard's declarations about blood rights. Daniel had taught me well that in any battle with his family, documentation was ammunition. The rest of the reception passed in a blur of condolences and shared memories. Daniel's employees from Morrison Tech Solutions approached me throughout the evening, expressing not just sympathy, but concern about the future of the company without Daniel's leadership. Several mentioned that Richard had already sent emails about restructuring and possible absorption into the main company. As the reception wound down, Patricia made a show of air-kissing my cheeks, while whispering that I should start looking for an apartment soon, as these transitions were easier when done quickly. Jennifer handed me a business card for a moving company, saying she had used them for her divorce, and they were very efficient. Thomas reminded me that he would need access to Daniel's home office to review company documents. Richard saved his final word for when most guests had departed. He stood by the memorial table, straightening Daniel's photo with mock tenderness, then turned to me with the smile of a predator, certain of its prey. 3 days, Madison. I will give you 3 days to grieve. Then we meet to discuss the orderly transfer of Morrison family assets. Thomas will send you the meeting details. Oh, and that house in Bellevue, I would start packing. The new owners will want to take possession quickly. New owners, I asked, though I suspected the answer. Patricia and I have decided to downsize from our current estate, he said with satisfaction. That house will suit us perfectly for our retirement years. Consider it keeping Daniel's memory close to the family heart. They left together a united front of entitlement and cruelty, apparently confident that the grieving widow would crumble under their pressure. What they did not know was that Daniel had spent his last coherent weeks making sure I would be protected. They also did not know that I had already contacted Sarah Coleman, my law school roommate, who had become one of Seattle's most successful estate attorneys. But most importantly, they did not know the secret that Daniel had discovered just weeks before his death, a secret about my own identity that would shatter everything the Morrison family believed about blood family and rightful inheritance. 3 days after the funeral, exactly as Richard had promised, I received a formal email from Thomas's law firm requesting my presence at a meeting to discuss the disposition of estate assets. The tone was cold and corporate, referring to my husband simply as the deceased, and to our home as the Bellevue property. I forwarded it immediately to Sarah Coleman, who responded within minutes with advice to attend, but say nothing without her present. Sarah and I met at her office the morning of the scheduled meeting. She had been my roommate at University of Washington before I dropped out to pursue design, and she continued to law school. We had stayed close through the years, and she had been one of the few people from my past that Daniel had genuinely liked and trusted. Now, sitting across from her massive oak desk, I was grateful for both her friendship and her formidable legal mind. "I need you to prepare yourself for something," Sarah said, pulling out a thick folder of documents. "When you asked me to review Daniel's estate papers, I found something unusual. Your name appears in multiple forms across different documents, sometimes Madison Miller, sometimes Madison E. Miller, but on one very old trust document, it says Madison Elizabeth Richardson." "Richardson?" I shook my head. "That must be a mistake. My name is Madison Miller, has been since I was adopted at 3 years old." Sarah leaned forward, her expression serious. "That is what triggered my deeper investigation. Madison, what do you know about your biological parents?" The question hit me unexpectedly. "Very little. My adoptive parents, the Millers, told me my birth mother died in childbirth and my father died in an accident when I was 3. They never knew their names. The adoption was closed, sealed by the court." Sarah pulled out another document, this one clearly aged and bearing official seals. "I have a contact at the courthouse who helped me access sealed records legally, given the estate implications. Your birth name was Madison Elizabeth Richardson. Your mother was Elizabeth Grant Richardson, who did die giving birth to you. Your father was James Richardson." The name meant nothing to me, but Sarah's expression suggested it should. She continued pulling out a photocopy of an old newspaper article from 1994. James Richardson was Richard Morrison's business partner. They founded Morrison Construction Group together in 1990, except back then it was called Richardson Morrison Construction. James owned 40%, Richard owned 40%, and the remaining 20% was held by early investors. My hands started shaking as I read the article, which featured a photo of 2 young men standing in front of a construction site, arms around each other's shoulders like brothers. One was clearly a younger Richard Morrison. The other, James Richardson, had my eyes, my nose, the same stubborn set to his jaw that I saw in the mirror every morning. Sarah pulled out another article, this one from 1995. "James Richardson died in a construction site accident when you were 3 years old. A beam fell from a crane, crushing him instantly. There were questions about safety protocols, but the investigation was closed quickly. Richard Morrison was the only witness." I felt the blood drain from my face as the implications started to sink in. Sarah was not done. She pulled out a legal document, its pages yellow with age, but the text still clearly legible. "This is James Richardson's last will and testament, filed with the court 2 months before his death. In it, he leaves everything to his infant daughter, Madison Elizabeth Richardson, with provisions for a trust to be managed until she turned 30. The trustee named was Richard Morrison, with the stipulation that if Madison could not be found, the assets would remain in trust for 10 years, then revert to the trustee. But Richard told everyone there were no heirs." I whispered, the pieces starting to come together in horrifying clarity. Sarah nodded grimly. "He filed documents with the court stating that despite extensive searches, no heir could be located. Your adoption records were sealed, your name was changed, and you effectively disappeared from legal existence as Madison Richardson. Richard has been profiting from your father's 40% of the company for 29 years." The room spun slightly as I processed this information. But how did Daniel know? Why did his will reference Madison Richardson? Sarah pulled out another document, this one in Daniel's handwriting. "He left this with his will, to be opened only if questions arose about your identity." "Should I read it?" I nodded, unable to speak. Sarah's voice was gentle as she read Daniel's words. "My dearest Madison, if you are reading this, it means I am gone, and the truth needs to be told. 3 months ago, while organising Father's files for the company audit, I found a box of old documents in a storage unit. Among them were papers about James Richardson, my father's former partner. There was a photo of James with his baby daughter, Madison Elizabeth, dated 1994. When I saw it, I knew immediately it was you. The resemblance was unmistakable. Sarah paused, allowing me to absorb this, then continued reading. I hired a private investigator to confirm what I suspected. You are James Richardson's daughter, the rightful heir to 40% of Morrison Construction Group, now worth approximately $47 million when you account for 29 years of growth and dividends. My father knew who you were the moment I introduced you. The look on his face was not disapproval of your social status, it was fear. He knew that one day the truth might come out. I was crying now, understanding finally why Daniel had been so insistent about protecting me, about documenting everything. Sarah handed me tissues and continued. I also discovered something else. Your father's death was not an accident. There are witness statements that were never filed with the police workers who saw my father arguing with yours that day, who heard my father threaten that James would not live to see his daughter grow up if he did not sell his shares. I have these statements notarized and secured. My father is not just a thief, Madison. He is likely a murderer. The letter went on to detail where Daniel had hidden copies of all the evidence in safety deposit boxes at 3 different banks, with digital copies stored on encrypted servers. He had built me a legal fortress while dying of brain cancer, knowing his family would come for me when he was gone. Sarah let me cry for several minutes before speaking again. Madison, this changes everything. You are not just fighting for Daniel's estate. You are fighting for your birthright, for justice for your father, and potentially for criminal prosecution of Richard Morrison. But I loved Daniel for who he was, not for money or connections, I said through my tears. I did not know any of this. Sarah squeezed my hand. Daniel knew that. In his letter, he specifically states that you never knew your true identity during your marriage, that your love was real and uninfluenced by this information. He wanted to tell you, but he was afraid it would put you in danger while Richard was still unaware that Daniel knew. We spent the next 2 hours reviewing everything. Sarah had already begun forensic accounting, tracing 29 years of profits from James Richardson's 40% share. The compound interest alone was staggering. Richard Morrison had built his empire on stolen wealth, using my inheritance to fund his expansion while I grew up in a modest apartment with adoptive parents who worked multiple jobs to pay for my college. We need to be strategic about this, Sarah advised. Richard Morrison is powerful, connected, and dangerous. We reveal this at the meeting today, but we need protection first. I have already contacted the FBI about potential interstate fraud and the district attorney about the possible murder. They are very interested. As we prepared to leave for the meeting at Thomas's law firm, Sarah handed me one more document. This was also in Daniel's papers. A DNA test he had done, secretly comparing your hair to a sample from his grandfather Richard's father. You are definitively related. The science is undeniable. I looked at the genetic markers, the proof of my identity mapped out in scientific certainty. Daniel had thought of everything, even the possibility that Richard would claim the documents were forged. My husband had spent his dying days building me an unassailable case against his own father. Sarah drove us to Thomas's firm in her Tesla, the silence heavy with anticipation. As we pulled into the parking garage, she turned to me with a fierce expression. Madison, they are about to receive the shock of their lives, but I need you to stay calm. Let me do the talking initially. Richard Morrison is cornered and dangerous when cornered. We have FBI agents on standby if needed. I nodded, clutching the folder of documents that would change everything. As we rode the elevator to the 20th floor, I thought about Daniel, about how he must have felt discovering this truth, knowing his father had built everything on blood and lies. I thought about my biological father, James Richardson, who had died when I was too young to remember him. and I thought about justice, long delayed, but finally arriving. The receptionist at Thomas's firm greeted us with professional coldness, clearly briefed about who we were and why we were there. She led us to a large conference room where the Morrison family was already assembled, looking like a board of directors ready to hostile take over a small company. The conference room was designed to intimidate, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Elliott Bay, a massive mahogany table that could seat 20, and walls lined with legal volumes that suggested centuries of precedent weighing against anyone who dared challenge the firm. Richard sat at the head of the table, like a king holding court Patricia to his right, with her perfectly manicured hands folded Thomas to his left, with stacks of documents spread before him, and Jennifer beside her mother already typing on her phone. Thomas stood as we entered, his smile sharp as a blade. "Ms. Miller, thank you for coming. I see you have brought counsel. That seems unnecessary for what should be a straightforward discussion of asset transfer. Sarah Coleman, I represent Mrs. Morrison in all matters relating to her late husband's estate." Sarah announced, deliberately using my married name to emphasize my legal standing. "And I would correct you, Mr. Morrison. My client's legal name is Madison Morrison, widow of Daniel Morrison, and entitled to all rights thereof." Patricia let out a small, dismissive laugh. "Rights. The only right she has is to vacate family property in a timely manner. We have been more than generous in giving her a week to process her grief." Richard leaned forward, his presence filling the room with menace disguised as authority. "Let us not waste time with pleasantries. Thomas has prepared a settlement offer, $50,000, and we cover moving expenses. In exchange, Madison signs over all claims to Daniel's estate, the house the company shares, and any joint accounts. It is more than fair for a 5-year marriage that produced no heirs." Thomas pushed a stack of documents across the table. "The papers are already drawn up. Sign here and you can have the check today. You can start fresh, find someone more appropriate to your station." Sarah did not even glance at the papers. She pulled out her own folder, thick with documents and photographs. "Before we discuss any settlements, there are some facts that need to be established. Mrs. Morrison, would you please state your full legal name for the record?" I looked directly at Richard as I spoke. "My adopted name is Madison Miller Morrison, but my birth name, the name I was given by my biological parents, is Madison Elizabeth Richardson." The colour drained from Richard's face so quickly I thought he might faint. Patricia looked confused. Thomas frowned as he tried to process the information, and Jennifer actually looked up from her phone. "Richardson," Thomas repeated slowly. "That is not possible." The Richardson line ended with James. There were no heirs. Sarah pulled out the first document, sliding it across the table with deliberate precision. "Birth certificate. Madison Elizabeth Richardson, born March 15th, 1992. Father James Richardson. Mother Elizabeth Grant Richardson." Richard's hand trembled as he reached for the document, his eyes scanning it with growing horror. Thomas snatched it from his father's hands, studying it with his lawyer's eye for any sign of forgery. Sarah continued, her voice calm but relentless. "James Richardson, co-founder of Richardson Morrison Construction, 40% owner at the time of his death in 1995. His will properly executed and filed with the court, leaving everything to his infant daughter, Madison Elizabeth Richardson." She placed the will on the table, followed by the partnership agreement, the trust documents, and finally the court filing, where Richard had sworn no heir could be found. "This is impossible," Patricia whispered, looking between the documents and her husband. "Richard, you told me James had no family. You said the shares reverted to you by default." Richard's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "These documents are obviously forged. This is an elaborate fraud attempting to steal from my family." Sarah smiled, a predator recognizing wounded prey. "I anticipated you might say that." She pulled out the DNA test results. Genetic comparison between Madison Morrison and hair samples from Charles Morrison, your late father Richard. The results confirm familial relationship. Madison is definitively related to the Morrison family, which is only possible if she is exactly who these documents say she is. Thomas was rapidly typing on his laptop, his face growing paler with each search result. The adoption records, the timeline, the sealed court documents. It all matches. But how did we not know? Your father knew. I said, my voice stronger than I expected. He knew the moment Daniel introduced me 5 years ago. That is why you all hated me from the first moment. Not because I was beneath your social class, but because I was the one person who could expose 29 years of theft and fraud. Jennifer finally understood the implications. Wait, if she is James Richardson's daughter, then she owns 40% of the original company. That is worth approximately $47 million when you account for growth and reinvested dividends over 29 years, Sarah supplied helpfully, plus punitive damages for fraud, plus interest, plus potential criminal charges for theft, fraud, and conspiracy. Richard stood suddenly, his chair scraping against the floor. You cannot prove anything. James died in an accident. The company grew because of my leadership, my vision. This gold digger cannot waltz in here and claim credit for my life's work. Sarah pulled out another document, this one making Richard freeze mid-rant. Sworn affidavit from Marcus Webb, former construction worker, stating that he witnessed Richard Morrison and James Richardson arguing on the day of James's death. Quote, Mr. Morrison said that Richardson would not live to see his daughter grow up if he did not sell his shares. She pulled out another. Affidavit from Gloria Patterson, former secretary, stating that Richard Morrison asked her to falsify safety inspection records after James Richardson's death, and another. Bank records showing large cash withdrawals by Richard Morrison paid to various officials during the investigation into James Richardson's death. Murder, Patricia gasped, standing and backing away from her husband. You killed him. You killed your partner and stole from his baby. It was an accident, Richard roared, then immediately realized what he had admitted. Thomas grabbed his father's arm, whispered urgently about self-incrimination. But the damage was done. Sarah had been recording the entire meeting legally, with notice posted at the door of the conference room. She pulled out her phone and sent a message. Within minutes, the door opened and 2 FBI agents entered, followed by a detective from Seattle PD, Richard Morrison. You are under arrest for interstate fraud, theft, and conspiracy. You have the right to remain silent, the lead agent announced as his partner moved to handcuff Richard. This is a mistake, Richard shouted as the handcuffs clicked. Thomas, do something. But Thomas had moved away from his father, his own legal career flashing before his eyes. He knew being too close to this would end his practice. I need to recuse myself from this matter. I had no knowledge of any fraud. Jennifer was crying, whether from shock or the realization that her family fortune was built on blood money was unclear. Patricia stood frozen, watching her husband of 35 years being led away in handcuffs. As Richard was escorted past me, he stopped the agents, allowing him one moment. You may have won this round, but I will destroy you. You are nothing but the bastard daughter of a weak man who could not protect what was his. I stood meeting his eyes with a strength I had not known I possessed. My father was James Richardson, who built a company with his bare hands. My husband was Daniel Morrison, who loved me enough to ensure justice would be done even after his death. I am Madison Richardson. Morrison and I am everything you feared. I would be the truth you could not bury, the justice you could not escape. The agents led him away, his threats echoing down the hallway until the elevator doors closed. Thomas immediately began gathering his papers, muttering about conflicts of interest and ethical obligations. Jennifer helped Patricia to a chair where the older woman sat staring at nothing, her perfect world shattered. Sarah turned to Thomas with professional courtesy. I will be filing for immediate injunction to freeze all Morrison family assets pending forensic accounting. I suggest you get at your mother independent counsel. She may be able to separate her assets if she can prove she had no knowledge of the fraud. What about the house? Patricia asked weakly. Our homes, our accounts. Sarah's expression softened slightly. The court will determine what was purchased with legitimate funds versus stolen assets. You should prepare for significant changes. As we left the conference room, I heard Jennifer ask her mother what they were going to do. Patricia's response was barely audible. I do not know. For 35 years, I do not know who I married. The news of Richard Morrison's arrest spread through Seattle's business community like wildfire. Within hours, the story had made national news. Billionaire arrested for 3-decade fraud. Construction magnate charged in partner's death. Widow discovers shocking identity after husband's funeral. The headlines were sensational, but they barely captured the full scope of what was unfolding. Sarah had moved quickly to protect my interests and safety. The FBI placed me in protective custody at a hotel downtown while they searched Richard's properties for additional evidence. What they found exceeded even our expectations. Hidden safes contained original documents Richard had claimed were destroyed, including correspondence where he detailed his plan to eliminate James Richardson and claim his shares. Thomas, desperate to save his own career, turned state's evidence. He revealed years of fraudulent filings his father had ordered him to create shell companies designed to hide assets and offshore accounts where Richard had funneled money. In exchange for his cooperation, Thomas received immunity from prosecution but was disbarred from practicing law. His wife, the senator's daughter, filed for divorce within a week. Jennifer attempted to salvage something from the wreckage by starting a GoFundMe, claiming she was a victim of her father's crimes. It raised $12 before being taken down for violating the platform's terms of service. She moved in with her mother, who had filed for divorce, and was fighting to keep the one property she had inherited from her own parents before marriage. The forensic accounting took 3 months to complete. The true value of what had been stolen from me was staggering. Beyond the $47 million in company value and dividends, there were properties purchased with profits from my father's shares, investments made with stolen capital, and interest accumulated over 3 decades. The total amount owed to me exceeded $70 million. But the criminal trial was where the full truth emerged. The prosecution had built an airtight case with the evidence Daniel had gathered and what the FBI discovered. Former employees testified about Richard's violent temper, his threats against James, his obsession with full control of the company. The safety inspector, who had been bribed, finally came forward, conscience heavy after decades of silence. The most damaging testimony came from Richard's own brother, Charles Jr., who had remained silent for 30 years. He testified that Richard had confessed to him after James's death, admitted to loosening the bolts on the crane that dropped the beam. Charles Jr. had been too afraid of his brother to speak up then, but facing his own mortality from cancer, he wanted to clear his conscience. Richard's defense team tried to paint me as an opportunist who had somehow orchestrated an elaborate fraud. They suggested Daniel and I had conspired to create false documents, that our entire marriage had been a long con. The strategy backfired spectacularly when Sarah presented the timeline. Daniel and I had met naturally, fallen in love genuinely, and married without any knowledge of my true identity. The jury saw the truth that I was as much a victim as my father had been. During the trial, something unexpected happened. People who had known my father began reaching out. Former employees of Richardson, Morrison construction friends from his college days, even his elderly mother, my grandmother, who I had never known existed. They shared stories of James Richardson painting a picture of a kind, innovative man who had been excited about becoming a father. My grandmother, Ellen Richardson, now 83, had been told I died with my mother in childbirth. Richard had sent her a death certificate, and photos from a supposed funeral. We met for coffee in Pike Place Market, both of us crying as she held my hands and told me I had my father's eyes and his stubborn chin. She had boxes of photos, letters my father had written about his dreams for my future, even a trust fund he had set up for my education that Richard had claimed but never dispersed. The trial lasted 6 weeks. Richard took the stand in his own defence, still arrogant, still convinced he could talk his way out of consequences. But when confronted with Daniel's video testimony recorded before his death, detailing his father's patterns of abuse and manipulation, even Richard's composure cracked. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Guilty on all counts: murder in the second degree, wire fraud, interstate commerce fraud, conspiracy, theft. The judge sentenced him to 45 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole. At 62, it was effectively a life sentence. As they led him away, Richard looked at me one last time. I expected hatred, but what I saw was worse. It was nothing. The absence of any human emotion, just the cold calculation of a man who had gambled with lives and lost. Patricia divorced Richard before the trial concluded, managing to retain about $2 million that predated the marriage and her parents' small estate. She moved to Arizona to live with her sister, sending me a letter 6 months later apologizing for her treatment of me and Daniel. She admitted she had suspected something was wrong, but had chosen comfortable ignorance over difficult truth. I wrote back, not forgiving, but acknowledging her apology. With Richard imprisoned and the legal battles largely resolved, I was faced with a decision about what to do with Morrison Construction Group. The board of directors, eager to distance themselves from scandal, offered to buy out my 40% share for $60 million. It was tempting to take the money and walk away from anything connected to the Morrison name. But then I thought about my father, James Richardson, who had built this company with his hands and dreams. I thought about Daniel, who had loved me enough to protect my birthright even while dying. I thought about justice, not just as punishment, but as restoration. I refused the buyout. Instead, I took my seat on the board as the largest individual shareholder. My first motion was to rename the company to its original name, Richardson Morrison Construction. My second was to establish the Daniel Morrison Foundation for Brain Cancer Research with an initial endowment of $10 million. My third was to create the James Richardson Memorial Scholarship for children who had lost parents to workplace accidents. The old guard resisted, but I had allies among the younger board members who saw opportunity in reform. Within a year, we had transformed the company culture, implementing the strictest safety standards in the industry, profit sharing for all employees, and partnerships with local communities for affordable housing projects. The company's value doubled in 18 months, proving that ethical business was also good business. 6 months after the trial ended, I stood in the office that had once been Richard Morrison's, and before that, my father, James Richardson's. The view stretched across Elliott Bay to the Olympic Mountains, Seattle's skyline reflecting the morning sun. The space had been completely renovated, the dark mahogany and leather, replaced with light woods and glass photos of construction projects that helped communities rather than just generating profit. Sarah Coleman, now my general counsel and close friend, knocked on the door. "You have a visitor," she said with an unusual smile, "someone who has been trying to reach you for weeks." I was surprised when Patricia Morrison walked in looking older, but somehow lighter than I had ever seen her. She was dressed simply. Gone were the designer suits and jewelry that had been her armor. She looked like a woman who had finally exhaled after holding her breath for 35 years. "Thank you for seeing me," she said, sitting across from my desk without the imperious attitude that had once defined her. "I know I do not deserve your time, but there is something you need to know." I waited, having learned that silence often invited more truth than questions. "Daniel knew," she said finally, "about you, about who you really were. Not the details, but he sensed something the first time he brought you home. He told me you felt familiar, like someone he had known forever, but just met. I thought it was romantic nonsense, but now I understand. Some part of him recognized that you were connected to the truth he had been searching for his whole life. She pulled out an envelope worn from handling. He gave me this when he was first diagnosed, told me to give it to you if anything happened to him, and his father tried to take everything. I was too much of a coward to honor his request at the funeral. But I am here now. I opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a single sheet of paper in Daniel's handwriting. My dearest Madison, if you are reading this through my mother's hand, it means she finally found the courage Daniel always believed she possessed. I knew from our first meeting that you were meant to change everything, not because of who your father was, though I suspected even then, but because of who you are. You were the truth our family needed, the light that would finally expose the shadows. My father built an empire on lies and blood. You will build something better on truth and love. I love you beyond death, beyond secrets, beyond time. Be brave, my darling. The truth always wins if someone is brave enough to speak it. Forever yours, Daniel. I was crying by the time I finished reading, and when I looked up, Patricia was crying too. She had lost everything, her husband to prison, her son to cancer, her daughter to shame, her wealth to justice. But in losing everything, she had found something she had never had the freedom to be herself. I kept the Bellevue house, she said. Daniel was right. It should be yours. I put the deed in your name. It is not compensation for what my family took from you. Nothing could compensate for that. But Daniel chose that house for you, decorated it with you lived his happiest years there with you. It should be yours. I started to protest, but she held up her hand. I am moving to a small apartment near my sister. I want simplicity now, truth, even if it is uncomfortable. For 35 years, I lived in a mansion built on blood. I cannot do it anymore. We talked for 2 more hours, not as former in-laws, but as 2 women who had loved the same man in different ways and lost him to different tragedies. She told me stories about Daniel as a child, how he had always been different from his father, and siblings, always questioning, always seeking truth, even when it made life harder. I told her about our life together, the small moments she had missed by keeping herself distant, the man her son had become despite his father's influence. As she prepared to leave, Patricia turned at the door. Madison, I need you to know something. What Richard did to your father, to you, it was not about money or power. It was about fear. He was afraid that James was the better man, the better businessman, the better father. And he was right. The proof is in what you and Daniel became despite his efforts to corrupt or destroy you. You are your father's daughter, and Daniel saw that. It is why he loved you, not in spite of who you were, but because of it. A year passed. Richardson Morrison construction continued to thrive under new leadership. The Daniel Morrison Foundation funded groundbreaking research that led to new treatment protocols for glioblastoma patients. The James Richardson Memorial Scholarship sent dozens of children to college. I divided my time between running the company and volunteering at the cancer center, where Daniel had received treatment. Thomas Morrison, disbarred and divorced, reached out through Sarah to request a meeting. Against my better judgment, I agreed. He looked diminished working now as a construction consultant living in a studio apartment in Tacoma. He did not ask for money or forgiveness, only understanding. I spent my whole life trying to earn my father's approval, he said, looking older than his 40 years. I became a lawyer because he wanted legal protection. I married for connections because he valued power over love. I betrayed my own sister in her divorce because he told me to. And for what? He would have thrown me under the bus the moment it benefited him. You and Daniel, you had 5 years of real love. That is more than I have had in a lifetime. I felt no obligation to comfort him, but I offered him some truth. Your father corrupted everything he touched, Thomas. But you chose to let him. Every day you chose. Daniel chose differently. Even dying, he chose love over fear, truth over comfort. You can still choose differently. It is not too late to become someone else. 6 months later, I heard Thomas was working with legal aid, helping construction workers who had been injured on unsafe sites get compensation. It was not redemption, but it was a start. Jennifer Morrison disappeared into obscurity, moving to Portland, where she worked as a barista and told no one about her family name. She sent me a message once, not asking for anything, just saying she was sorry for how she had treated Daniel and me. I did not respond, but I hoped she found peace in anonymity that she never found in privilege. Ellen Richardson, my grandmother, became a regular part of my life. We had dinner every Sunday where she would tell me stories about my father and show me photos I had never seen. Through her memories, I came to know James Richardson not just as a victim, but as a full person who had loved mathematics and music, who had built things with his hands since childhood, who had cried with joy when I was born. 2 years after Daniel's death, I stood at his grave on a sunny Tuesday afternoon, the same day of the week and time he had passed. The headstone was simple as he would have wanted, just his name dates and the words, "Beloved husband, truth seeker, light bringer." I had news to share with him, the kind that would have made him smile, that particular smile that crinkled his eyes and made my heart race, even after years together. Richardson Morrison Construction had just won the bid to build the new Children's Hospital, a project that would provide free healthcare to thousands of kids whose families could not afford treatment. The design incorporated healing gardens and natural light, things Daniel had always said hospitals needed more of during his own treatment. The Daniel Morrison Foundation had reached a milestone of funding $20 million in research grants. A new drug trial, inspired by research we had funded, was showing remarkable results in extending life expectancy for brain cancer patients. It would not have saved Daniel, the researchers told me, but it might save others, and that would have been enough for him. But the biggest news was personal. After 2 years of grieving and healing, I had started dating again. His name was Marcus Chen, an architect who had designed several of our community housing projects. He was nothing like Daniel, quieter, more careful with his emotions, but he understood loss, having lost his own wife to leukemia 5 years ago. We took things slowly, both of us carrying ghosts, but learning to live with them rather than for them. Marcus knew my entire story, the inheritance, the trial, the weight of running a company built on tragedy, transformed into purpose. He never tried to replace Daniel or compete with his memory. Instead, he created space beside it, understanding that loving again did not mean loving less. I told Daniel all of this, speaking to his headstone as if he could hear me. I told him about the company's success, the foundation's impact, the slowly healing relationships with what remained of his family. I told him about Marcus, about the possibility of happiness that did not diminish the happiness we had shared. I told him I was keeping my name, Madison Richardson Morrison, because it carried both my father's and my husband, all the men who had loved me and shaped who I had become. As I prepared to leave, I noticed someone approaching from across the cemetery. It was Patricia, carrying a small bouquet of Daniel's favourite flowers, bright yellow sunflowers, that seemed too cheerful for a graveyard, but perfect for who he had been. We had not planned to meet, but it seemed fitting that we were both here. 2 women who had loved Daniel differently, but completely. "She tells me the company is doing well," Patricia said, nodding toward the headstone as if Daniel had been speaking to her. "He would be proud of what you have built from the ashes of what Richard destroyed." We stood together in comfortable silence, two women who had once been enemies, now bound by shared loss and hard-won understanding. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cemetery, and somewhere in the distance a bird sang a complicated song that Daniel would have tried to identify. "Patricia," I said finally, "the board is looking for someone to head our new community relations division. Someone who understands the importance of connection between companies and families. Would you consider it?" She looked at me with surprise that shifted to something like gratitude. "I am 61 years old, Madison. I have not worked in 30 years. You raised 3 children, managed massive charity events, and survived 35 years with Richard Morrison. I think you are qualified. Besides, Daniel always said you were smarter than you let anyone see. Maybe it is time to prove him right." She smiled, the first genuine smile I had ever seen from her. "I will think about it. And Madison, thank you for everything, for showing us who we really were, even when the truth was painful, for honoring Daniel's memory by living fully, for being the daughter-in-law I was too blind to see, and the woman my son was wise enough to love." 3 months later, Patricia Morrison joined Richardson Morrison Construction as Vice President of Community Relations. She was brilliant at it, using her years of society connections to build partnerships with non-profits and community organizations. She found purpose in work that helped others, something she had been denied during her years as Richard's ornamental wife. Thomas continued his work with legal aid and eventually opened his own practice focused on workers' rights. He and I developed a cautious, professional relationship, referring cases to each other when appropriate. He never fully atoned for his past, but he tried to balance the scales one case at a time. Jennifer found her own path in Portland, eventually opening a small coffee shop that became known for employing people rebuilding their lives after trauma or incarceration. She sent me a card every year on Daniel's birthday, never asking for anything, just acknowledging the date and the loss. 5 years after Daniel's death, Richardson Morrison Construction was valued at $300 million. We had built affordable housing across Washington state, revolutionized safety standards in the industry, and created a profit-sharing model that became a Harvard Business School case study. The company my father and Richard had founded on ambition had become something neither could have imagined, a force for community building and social justice. The Daniel Morrison Foundation had funded research that led to 3 new treatment protocols for brain cancer. The 5-year survival rate for glioblastoma had increased by 12%, not a cure, but progress Daniel would have celebrated. Every life extended was a victory against the disease that had taken him too soon. Marcus and I married in a small ceremony at Snoqualmie Falls, the same place Daniel and I had wed 7 years earlier. It was not replacing one love with another, but adding new chapters to a story that death had interrupted but not ended. Patricia stood as one of my witnesses, Ellen Richardson as the other. We honored both the ghosts and the living understanding that love was not diminished by being shared. On what would have been Daniel's 45th birthday, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a USB drive containing hundreds of photos and videos. I had never seen Daniel from childhood through college, moments his family had captured but never shared. There was also a note in Jennifer's handwriting that said simply, "He would want you to have these. You knew him better than we ever did." I spent the entire night watching Daniel grow up in fast forward, seeing the sweet boy become the man I had loved. Watching him navigate his family's coldness with grace and humor. In one video from his college graduation, he spoke about his dreams for the future, to build something meaningful, to find someone who saw him for who he really was, to leave the world better than he found it. He had achieved all of those dreams in his too short life. As I write this, it has been 7 years since Daniel's death, since that awful meeting where Richard Morrison tried to take everything and instead lost everything. The Bellevue house where Daniel and I lived stands as a testament to love that transcends death and truth that refuses to stay buried. I have turned one room into a study where I keep photos of three men: James Richardson, the father I never knew, but whose legacy I carry; Daniel Morrison, the husband who loved me enough to protect me even in death; and Marcus Chen, the partner who understands that hearts can expand rather than replace. Richardson Morrison, construction continues to grow, but more importantly, it continues to matter. Every building we construct carries the DNA of redemption, proof that companies built on lies can be reborn in truth. The Daniel Morrison Foundation has touched thousands of lives, extending time for families facing the same disease that stole him from me. The James Richardson scholarships have sent over 100 children to college, young people who might have been forgotten, like I almost was. Richard Morrison died in federal prison last year, alone and unrepented. I did not attend the funeral, but I sent flowers with a card that read, "For Daniel, who deserved a better father." Patricia called to tell me only she and a priest had attended. Thomas and Jennifer had chosen to stay away, finally free from the gravitational pull of his toxic presence. Sometimes I dream about a conversation between Daniel and my father James somewhere beyond this world, where truths are clear and love endures. I imagine them watching as their shared legacy, built on their different loves for the same woman, transforms an empire of greed into an instrument of grace. I imagine them proud not of the money or the buildings, but of the choice to turn tragedy into purpose. The last time I visited Daniel's grave, I brought Marcus and our newborn daughter, Eleanor Madison Chen, named for the grandmother who had welcomed me home and the identity that had changed everything. As I introduced Daniel to the baby he would never hold, I whispered the promise I make every time I visit. Your love saved me, your truth freed me, your memory guides me, and every good thing I do carries part of you forward. Because that is what love does. It does not end with death or bow to greed or accept lies as truth. Love fights, even from beyond the grave, for justice and redemption and the possibility that broken things can be rebuilt into something beautiful. Daniel knew that. My father James knew that. And now, because of them, I know it too. The truth always wins, Daniel had written, if someone is brave enough to speak it. He was brave enough to gather it, preserve it, and ensure it would be spoken even after his voice was silenced. And I was brave enough finally to speak it into power and transform an empire built on blood into a legacy built on love. Have you ever discovered a truth about yourself that changed everything? Have you ever had to fight for what was rightfully yours against those who thought power meant possession? Share your story in the comments below. If this story touched your heart or reminded you that justice can prevail even against the powerful, please like this video and subscribe to hear more stories of triumph over tragedy. Share this with someone who needs to hear that sometimes the greatest inheritance is not money or property, but the courage to claim your truth and transform loss into purpose. Thank you for listening to my story. May you find the strength to face whatever truths await you, the wisdom to know that love transcends death, and the courage to build something beautiful from whatever broken pieces life hands you. Remember, you are more than what was taken from you. You are everything you choose to build from what remains.